Never thought I'd be the kind of man who'd end up testifying against his own flesh and blood in a federal courtroom. Hell, 6 months ago, if you'd told me I'd be sitting in a Chicago courthouse watching my brother get sentenced, I would have laughed in your face and offered to buy you a beer at O'Malley's. But that was before Easter Sunday. That was before my nephew looked up at me with those big hazel eyes and whispered something that ripped the floor right out from under my entire world. My name's Wyatt. I'm 43 years old, divorced, no kids of my own, and I work as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm out of Naperville, Illinois. Nothing fancy. I drive a 2017 Ford F-150 that I bought used 3 years ago. I rent a 2-bedroom townhouse, and on weekends, I usually grab a 6-pack and watch the Bears lose. That's my life. Quiet. Simple. The kind of life nobody writes books about. My brother Garrison, though, he was the golden boy. Always was. 3 years older than me, valedictorian at our high school back in Peoria, full scholarship to Northwestern, MBA from Kellogg, and a corner office at one of those big consulting firms downtown. He pulled in close to $400,000 a year, lived in a 6-bedroom colonial out in Hinsdale with a 3-car garage and a finished basement that he was always bragging about. Hardwood bar down there, custom pool table from some Italian company he flew in special, a wine cellar with temperature control, a home theater with leather recliners, the whole 9 yards. He married Talia about 10 years ago. She came from old Lake Forest money, the kind of family that's been there since before the highway went in. Pretty woman, blonde, always wearing those tennis bracelets that cost more than my truck. They had my nephew, Bodie, 6 years ago this past March. Just one kid. Talia said she didn't want to ruin her body again, and Garrison agreed because Garrison agreed with whatever made his life easier. I'll be honest with you. I never loved Garrison. I respected him. I admired him in that distant way you admire a celebrity. But love? Real brother love? The kind where you'd take a bullet? No. We grew up in the same house, ate the same hamburger helper dinners, watched the same reruns of Cheers on the same beat-up couch, but somewhere along the way Garrison decided I was beneath him. The blue-collar little brother, the one who didn't make anything of himself. He'd invite me over for Christmas because Mom was still alive back then, and she'd cry if he didn't, and he'd shake my hand at funerals, but he never once called me just to talk. Not in 20 years. Bodie was different though. From the moment that kid was born, he and I had something. I can't explain it. I'd visit and Garrison would be on a call in his office, and Talia would be at Pilates or whatever, and Bodie would just crawl up into my lap and want to read books. I taught him how to throw a baseball when he was 4. I taught him the names of all the constellations one summer night when they let him stay over at my place. He called me Uncle. Why? Because he couldn't quite get the T sound out when he was little, and even after he learned it, he still called me Uncle Y, like it was our thing, just ours. So when Talia called me in early April and invited me to Easter dinner, I said yes, even though I had a date that weekend with a woman from the gym named Cordelia, who I actually really liked. I canceled on her. I told her family came first. She wasn't happy about it, but she understood. I drove out to Hinsdale on Easter Sunday afternoon. It was a gorgeous day, mid-60s, sun out, all the dogwoods blooming on those rich people streets. I'd stopped at a Walgreens and picked up one of those plastic eggs filled with chocolate for Bodie and a bottle of Cabernet for Talia because I figured she'd appreciate it even though I knew Garrison would make some comment about how it wasn't from a real vineyard. I pulled into the long curved driveway and parked behind Talia's white Range Rover. Their house was something out of a magazine, manicured boxwoods, an American flag hanging proudly from a brass pole near the front entrance, those big columns that always made me think of plantation houses, the kind of place that whispered money. Talia answered the door wearing a pale yellow dress and pearls. She gave me one of those air kisses that don't actually touch your cheek, took the wine without looking at the label, and ushered me into the formal dining room where Garrison was already pouring himself a bourbon. Their in-laws were there, Talia's parents, an elderly couple named the Worthingtons who I'd met maybe 4 times in 10 years, and who looked at me the way you'd look at the guy who came to fix her dishwasher. There were a few other people too, some neighbors and a business partner of Garrison's named Donovan, who I vaguely remembered from a Christmas party, but Bodie wasn't with them. I asked where he was, and Talia waved her hand vaguely toward the staircase and said he was being difficult, that he didn't want to come down, that he'd been throwing little tantrums all week and she'd had just about enough. She rolled her eyes when she said it, like he was a piece of furniture that wasn't behaving correctly. I told her I'd go up and say hi. She didn't object. She just turned back to the canapes. I climbed those big curving stairs and walked down the hallway to Bodhi's room. The door was closed. I knocked, soft. I said, "Buddy, it's Uncle. Why? Can I come in?" Silence, then a tiny voice. "Are you alone?" That stopped me cold. Why would a 6-year-old ask if I was alone? I said yes, just me, and I pushed the door open slow. Bodhi was sitting on his bed in the corner, knees pulled up to his chest, wearing his Easter outfit, which was this little navy blue blazer and khaki pants and a clip-on bow tie. He looked so small. He looked so tired. There were dark circles under his eyes that no 6-year-old should have, and his hair was mussed in a way that made me think he'd been pulling at it. He didn't run to me like he usually did. He just stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, in the smallest voice I've ever heard him use, "Uncle, why can I stay up here? Please. I don't want to go down." I sat on the edge of his bed. I asked him what was wrong. Was he sick? Did his stomach hurt? He shook his head. He said, "The basement hurts me." I want you to understand something. I want you to really hear what I'm telling you right now. When a 6-year-old child says a sentence like that, it doesn't land in your brain the normal way. It doesn't fit into any of the boxes you have for things kids say. I don't like broccoli, that fits. My tummy hurts, that fits. The basement hurts me, that doesn't fit anywhere. It just sits there in the air between you, and your brain has to slowly try to figure out what it means. I asked him to say it again. I thought maybe I'd misheard. He didn't say it again. He just looked at the floor, and a single tear slid down his cheek, and he wiped it away with the back of his wrist, the way grown men do when they don't want anyone to see them cry. I told him he didn't have to go to the basement. I told him I'd stay right there with him. I told him Uncle, why I was here. He climbed into my lap and put his head against my chest. He felt so light. He felt like he was made of bird bones. I could feel his ribs through his little blazer. And I realized, sitting there on that bed, that I hadn't seen Bodhi in almost 4 months. The last time had been Christmas, and he'd lost weight, a noticeable amount. Talia called up the stairs that dinner was ready. I told Bodhi we'd go down together. I'd hold his hand. He didn't have to go to the basement. Easter dinner was in the dining room. He nodded, but he didn't seem convinced. We walked downstairs hand in hand. Bodhi was gripping my fingers so tight my knuckles ached. When we got to the dining room, everyone turned to look at us, and Bodhi froze in the doorway, just locked up, like a deer. Talia made a sharp little sound through her teeth and said, "Bodhi, come on. Stop being silly. Sit in your chair." His chair was at the corner of the table, between Garrison and the Worthingtons. He shook his head. He pressed his back into my leg. Garrison set down his bourbon. He said, very calmly, very coldly, Bodhi, can your chair, now." Bodhi started crying. Not loud, quiet, tears just running down his face while he stood there shaking. I said, "Hey, why don't I sit next to him? He can sit between me and Talia. He'll be more comfortable." Garrison looked at me the way he used to look at me when we were kids and I'd spilled something on his homework. He said, "Wyatt, he has a chair. He'll sit in it." Talia stood up and walked around the table. She grabbed Bodhi's arm, not gently. She pulled him toward his chair and she said, "Enough. You are embarrassing me in front of our guests. Sit down." She forced him into the chair, physically lifted him by his armpits and put him there, and Bodhi just collapsed inward, sobbing now, his little shoulders shaking, his hands covering his face. The Worthingtons looked away. Donovan studied his wine glass. Nobody said a word. Garrison said, "He's being dramatic. Ignore him. He's been like this for weeks, acting out for attention." I sat down in my seat across from Bodhi. My hands were trembling under the table. I forced myself to take a sip of water. I forced myself to make small talk about the new condos going up on Roosevelt Road. Inside, my whole body was screaming at me that something was wrong. That something was very, very wrong. About 15 minutes into the meal, I excused myself to use the bathroom. Instead, I went to the kitchen to refill my water. I stood at the sink looking out the window at their perfect backyard, and I tried to talk myself down. I told myself kids go through phases. I told myself maybe he'd been spooked by something on TV. I told myself Garrison was a good father. He had to be. Look at this house. Look at this life. That's when I heard the soft padding of little feet behind me. Bodhi had followed me into the kitchen. He was standing in the doorway, looking back over his shoulder to make sure no one had seen him. He walked over to me and tugged on my pant leg. He said, "Uncle." "Why?" "I need to show you something." I knelt down so we were eye to eye. I said, "What is it, buddy?" And then this 6-year-old kid, this tiny little person in a clip-on bow tie, slowly lifted the bottom of his white dress shirt, just an inch or two. And I saw it. I saw bruises, plural, old ones, yellowing at the edges, new ones, dark purple, almost black, in the shape of fingertips along his side and his lower back, and a longer mark, thin and red, that looked like it had been made by something narrow. A belt, maybe, or a cord. My vision went gray at the edges. I felt the kitchen tilt. Bodhi whispered, so quietly I had to lean in to hear. "Uncle, why? Every night when Mommy goes to sleep, Daddy takes me to the basement. He says I need to be tough. He says boys don't cry. He says if I tell, he'll hurt Mr. Bumbles." Mr. Bumbles was his stuffed bear. He'd had it since he was a baby. He slept with it every single night. I couldn't speak. I couldn't make my mouth work. I just pulled Bodhi against my chest and I held him, and I felt his little heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped sparrow. He said, "Don't tell Daddy I told you. Please, please, Uncle." "Why?" I told him I wouldn't. I told him he was safe. I told him I loved him more than anything in the whole world. I told him to go back to the table and finish his dinner and to pretend everything was normal and that I was going to fix it. I made him a promise right there in that kitchen. I told him, Uncle, I was going to make it stop. He nodded. He wiped his face with his sleeves. He walked back to the dining room. I stood at that sink for I don't know how long. Maybe 30 seconds. Maybe 2 minutes. My mind was a hurricane. Part of me wanted to walk straight into that dining room and put my fist through Garrison's face. Part of me wanted to grab Bodhi and run out the front door and drive straight to Indiana and never come back. Part of me wanted to throw up. But I made myself think. I made myself slow down. Because I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I lost my temper right then, Garrison would do what Garrison always did. He'd talk his way out of it. He'd say I was drunk, I was crazy, I was jealous of his life. He'd convince Talia. He'd convince the Worthingtons. He'd convince the police. He had the money. He had the lawyer friends. He had the country club golf buddies. He could buy a story, and the story he'd buy would be that his deadbeat brother Wyatt had finally lost it. I needed evidence. I needed it ironclad. I went back to the dining room. I sat down. I ate ham and scalloped potatoes. I laughed at one of Donovan's terrible jokes. I told Talia the table setting looked beautiful. I behaved like a man who had not just had his soul cracked open in a kitchen. After dinner, I asked Garrison if I could see his new wine cellar. He puffed up like a peacock. He led me down the basement stairs, and I made myself walk down them, made myself breathe normally, and the whole time I was looking at every corner, looking at every door. There was a side room near the back, past the bar, past the pool table, with a heavy wooden door and a keypad lock. I asked him what was in there. He waved his hand and said, "Just storage. Old files. Boring stuff." I filed that away. When I left that night, I hugged Bodhi tight. I whispered in his ear that Uncle Y loved him very much. He whispered back, "I love you too, Uncle Y." I drove home and I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of whiskey I never drank, and I thought, and I thought, and I thought. The next morning, Monday, I called in sick to work. Then I called a lawyer, a woman named Bristol who had handled my divorce. She wasn't a criminal lawyer, but she gave me the name of one, a man named Theron in the Loop who specialized in family abuse cases. I drove downtown and I sat in his office for 2 hours and I told him everything. He told me that without physical evidence in police hands, without a medical exam, without documentation, my word against my brother's wasn't going to be enough. Not against a man like Garrison with his money and his lawyers. He told me that what I really needed to do was call the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services and file a report. Anyone can file. Mandated reporters do it all the time. They'd open an investigation. They'd take Bodie for a medical exam. They'd interview him in a safe space with trained professionals. I called DCFS that same afternoon, sitting in my truck in the parking lot. I gave them everything. The bruises. The basement. The whispered confession. The weight loss. The fear in his eyes. Everything. The woman on the phone was kind but professional. She told me they'd send an investigator out within 24 hours. She told me to keep my distance, not to alert my brother, and to let the system do its job. Tuesday morning around 10 a.m., my phone rang. It was Talia. Her voice was shrill, hysterical. She was screaming. She said DCFS had shown up at the house. She said they'd taken Bodie for some kind of exam. She said they'd asked her questions. She said she knew it was me. She knew I'd done this. And how dare I? How dare I make up these horrible lies about my own brother? I didn't say anything. I just listened. Then Garrison got on the phone. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. It was low. It was murderous. He said, "Wyatt, if you've done what I think you've done, I will destroy you. I will sue you for everything you have. I will make sure you never see this family again." I said, "Garrison, I saw the bruises. I know what you did, and you're going to prison." He hung up. That afternoon, the investigator from DCFS called me. Her name was Marlowe. She said the medical exam had confirmed what I told them. Bodie's injuries were consistent with prolonged physical abuse. There were old fractures in his ribs that had healed wrong. There were burn marks on the soles of his feet that nobody had ever asked about. Bodie had told the forensic interviewer everything, in his own words, with a child psychologist present. She also told me something I will never forget. She said when they'd searched the basement with a warrant, they'd found the locked room, the keypad room, and inside they'd found things. She didn't tell me everything. She said the police would handle that. She just said, "Mr. Wyeth, your nephew is going to be okay. Because of you." I broke down crying in my truck in the Home Depot parking lot. Just sobbed like a baby for 20 minutes. The arrest happened Wednesday morning. Garrison was taken from his office downtown in handcuffs in front of his entire firm. The story made the local news by Wednesday evening. By Thursday, it was statewide. Wealthy Hinsdale executive arrested on multiple counts of felony child abuse and aggravated battery against a minor. Talia, to her credit, eventually broke. The investigators worked on her for weeks. At first she defended him. She said it was all a misunderstanding. She said her husband would never, but the evidence was overwhelming. And when they showed her what they'd found in that locked room, she collapsed. She admitted she had suspected something for months. She'd seen bruises and let Garrison explain them away as playground accidents. She'd heard Bodie crying at night and chosen to take a sleeping pill rather than investigate. She lost custody too. Bodie was placed in emergency foster care while the courts worked things out. I petitioned for guardianship. Theron walked me through every step. I had to prove I had stable housing, stable income, the means to care for a child. I had to take parenting classes. I had to undergo my own background checks and psychological evaluations. I had to convert my second bedroom into a child's room. I bought a twin bed and bear's bed sheets and a little desk and a bookshelf, and I painted the walls a soft blue, and I hung up a poster of the constellations because I remembered that night I'd taught him their names. 6 months later, I got the call. The judge had granted me permanent legal guardianship. Bodie was coming home with me. I drove to the foster home in Aurora to pick him up. He was sitting on the front porch with a little duffel bag and Mr. Bumbles in his lap. When he saw my truck pull in, he stood up, and he ran. Straight across that yard, straight into my arms. He buried his face in my chest and he said, "Uncle Y, did you make it stop?" I said, "Yeah, buddy, I made it stop." Garrison pleaded out eventually. His high-priced lawyers couldn't fight what the police had found. He took a deal. 22 years in federal prison. He'll be 65 when he gets out. Bodie will be 28. Talia got 18 months for failure to protect. She's out now. She lives in Florida with her parents. She has supervised visitation rights once a month, which she rarely uses. I don't comment on her parenting. I just make sure Bodhi knows that whatever choices the adults around him made, none of it was his fault. He was a child. He is a child. And being a child means you get to be loved without conditions. Bodhi has been living with me for almost 2 years now. He's 8 years old. He's in 2nd grade at a good public school out here in Naperville. He sees a child therapist named Dr. Knowing, Rosalind, twice a month. And we work through the hard stuff together. He has nightmares sometimes. He still doesn't like basements, and I had to explain to his teacher why he wouldn't go into the school's storage room on a field trip. But he laughs now. He laughs the way kids are supposed to laugh, big and unguarded, with his whole body. He plays Little League. I coach his team. We're not very good, but we have fun. He's learned how to throw a curveball that's better than mine ever was. He has friends. He has sleepovers. He calls me uncle. Why still? Except sometimes when he's half asleep. When I'm tucking him in, he calls me dad. I never correct him. He'll figure out what to call me when he's ready. I want to say something to anyone watching this. If a child tells you something doesn't feel right, you listen. You don't dismiss them. You don't roll your eyes. You don't say they're being dramatic. You get down on your knees, you look them in the eye, and you ask them what they need you to know, because sometimes the smallest voices are telling you the biggest truths. Bodhi told me the basement hurt him. He used the only words a 6-year-old has. And if I had ignored those words, if I had eaten my ham and gone home and minded my business the way Garrison wanted everyone to do, that boy might not be here today. That boy might not be here today. That boy might have ended up a statistic. Instead, he's upstairs right now. I can hear him through the floor. He's playing with his Legos. He's building something. He's humming a song from one of those cartoons he loves. He's safe. He's home. And every night, before I go to sleep, I make a promise to him, even though he can't hear me. I promise him that Uncle Y is never going anywhere. That this house, our little townhouse with the chain link fence and the broken porch light I keep meaning to fix, this is his. For as long as he wants it. That's the story. That's what happened to my family. I lost a brother, but I gained a son. And if I had to do it all over again, I'd do it the exact same way. Without hesitation, without regret. For Bodhi. Always for Bodhi. I've thought about that Easter Sunday 1,000 times since it happened. I've replayed it in my head while making Bodhi's school lunches, while sitting in the bleachers at his Little League games, while lying awake at 3 in the morning listening to him breathe in the room next to mine. And every time I replay it, I come back to the same simple truth. What we choose to do in a single moment can change the entire arc of someone's life. Mine. His. Even Garrison's, though he doesn't deserve a kinder fate than the one he earned. I think about cause and effect a lot now. My brother chose cruelty in private, and he chose it again and again, night after night in that locked basement room. He thought he was building something. He thought he was hardening his son into a man. What he was actually building was the case against himself. Every bruise, every burn, every whispered threat became a brick in the wall he locked himself behind for the next 22 years. He did that. Not me. I just refuse to look away. I want to say something to whoever's listening. 3 things actually. 3 things I'd come to believe with everything I am. The first is about character. The kind of person you are when no one's watching is the only kind of person you actually are. Garrison wore a $1,000 suit and lived in a 6-bedroom house and gave to charity at galas, and underneath all of it, he was rotten. Meanwhile, a 6-year-old boy who weighed less than my dog had more moral courage than every adult at that table. Bodhi told the truth, knowing he might be punished for it. That's character. Money can't buy it, and a corner office can't fake it. The second is about wisdom. Real wisdom isn't being the smartest person in the room. It's knowing when to slow down. If I had charged into that dining room swinging fists, Garrison would still be free today, and Bodhi might be dead. I had to hold the rage in my chest like a hot coal and walk it patiently to the right people. The right office, the right phone call. Anger is a tool, not a strategy. Knowing the difference saved my nephew's life. The third is about resilience. I'm not a hero. I was scared the whole time. Scared of losing my brother. Scared of being wrong. Scared of going broke fighting a custody battle. Scared of being a single father at 43. I did it anyway. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing while your hands shake. Bodhi taught me that. A 6-year-old taught me that. If a child ever pulls on your sleeve and tells you something doesn't feel right, you stop. You kneel. You listen. Their small voice might be the most important sentence you ever hear in your entire life.